Hi, my name is Jason Vieaux and I'm a classical guitarist. And I'd like just to share with you guys some of the similarities and differences between classical guitar and other kinds of guitar that you might be more familiar with. But also the classical music eras and how the guitar and its history fits into those eras. But just for quickly, the parts of the guitar and what makes this classical guitar, the modern classical guitar, different from, say, an acoustic guitar that you might see Dave Matthews or Taylor Swift or Bob Dylan play, that kind of thing. It is acoustic. Like a lot of times when you see they're playing something like that, like a singer-songwriter might play in popular music or even occasionally on a talent show like American Idol. The difference is that the strings on a classical guitar are made of nylon, whereas on another types of acoustic guitar, like what you would see normally in popular music, the strings are made of steel. And also in classical guitar, we're playing, the neck is a bit wider and the strings are a little further apart, and that's because we're playing many voices at the same time. And how we get those voices to speak is with the fingernails of our right hand, which have to be sort of carefully self-manicured and kind of groomed. And we have like automotive grade sandpaper like this over here that we use to polish them and nail files and such. So that's those are really the basic differences. The main difference to me always is really about the music. I mean, the guitar is actually a part of classical music history, which goes all the way back to the Renaissance era. So we can think of the Renaissance era as really coming from out of, before that, what we study in classical music is that there's medieval music, right? And then the Renaissance era, which is in the 1400s to about 1600, the Renaissance era throughout Europe really produced a lot of much more cultivated or elevated music. Music began to get a little bit more complex. And so a lot of these pieces and such still survive. In fact, the earliest guitar-based music is by that we have that survived is by Alonso Mudarra, a Spanish guitarist, and he wrote the first surviving music for guitar from three books called Tres Libros, three books. And probably the most well-known piece from that is a very short piece called Fantasia 10. So he wrote fantasias, he wrote pieces with variations, and so I like to play for you Fantasia 10. So here we go. We also play music from the lute repertoire of this period as well. That piece, Fantasia 10 by Mudarra, was actually written for a guitar-like instrument called the vihuela. At that time, the vihuela was about this big and had 4 courses. So what that means is 4 strings, but doubled. So each string had a different pitch, and then it had another one to match it. So 8 strings, but really only 4 different pitches. And so we play this piece on a modern instrument, but it was really written for the vihuela, which is really the earliest ancestor of the guitar. There are also lute, of course, many lute pieces. Now, the lute really began to flourish during the Renaissance era, and probably its greatest composer was the English lutenist John Dowland. And I'd like to play something for you by John Dowland. This is My Lady Hunsdon's Almain. That was My Lady Hunsdon's Almain by the great lute composer John Dowland. John Dowland also wrote a lot of famous songs that you can look up on YouTube. Flow My Tears, Come Again. And these are all, there's many versions on YouTube by many famous singers. Even the famous rock musician Sting of the great band The Police, one of my personal favorite rock bands. He loves John Dowland's music, and in fact did an entire album of his music with a lutenist playing underneath his voice. So next, and we were going to move now into the Baroque era. Now the Baroque era, we generally, historians mark that between around 1600. Of course, there's some transitional years, as you can imagine, when the music really starts to change, to about 1750, which is the death of Johann Sebastian Bach. And I'm going to play a little bit of some Bach for you in a second. But we are having a class here really about the guitar and its development as well, and how the guitar is involved in the history of classical music. So the Baroque guitar does not have tons of surviving solo pieces written for it. It was often used as an accompaniment for the voice, and it got the size of the instrument got a little bit bigger. It graduated to 5 doubled courses instead of the 4 doubled courses on the vihuela. But it wouldn't really be until the classical era, from 1750 until about 1820, when the guitar would really come into its own as a solo instrument. However, Gaspar Sanz, another Spaniard, and now you can see this kind of thread here that a lot of the guitar's history comes from Spain. Gaspar Sanz, S-A-N-Z, he wrote a very important work called Suite Espanola, Spanish suite, and probably the most famous piece from that is his Canarios. and so which refers, of course, to birds and birdsong. So I'd like to play the Canarios for you now. That was Canarios, or referring to the canary, by Gaspar Sanz, probably the most famous Baroque-era guitar piece. Now, guitars tend to, when they visit the Baroque era in a concert, we tend to play a lot of transcriptions. Often it's because the music is really quite a bit stronger in the case of, say, Domenico Scarlatti, who wrote over 500 keyboard sonatas, or Handel, or Telemann, or Rameau. But especially in the case of, well, for me, Johann Sebastian Bach, who is a composer who I don't really even think has been surpassed all these many years later. And Johann Sebastian Bach lived from 1685 to 1750, and I play a lot of his solo violin works, which are long works for the unaccompanied violin. Also, he wrote several lute works for the lute. Again, as I was saying before, the guitar was not an instrument that perhaps Bach was necessarily interested in writing for. It may have been an instrument that he didn't really come into contact with, or may have thought of it as more of a folksy instrument. The lute, however, was in the courts, and if you held a court position as you may hold that position as a keyboardist, such as Bach, or you may hold that court position as the court lutenist. And when you had a position like that, that was, a very important job, as you were there to not only perform but also to write music. And Bach had a couple of very important court positions in Germany. I also play a lot of the pieces from the unaccompanied cello suites. This is the Prelude from the first cello suite by Johann Sebastian Bach. That was one of my very favorite pieces of all time, the Prelude from the first unaccompanied, the first suite for unaccompanied cello by Johann Sebastian Bach. That's the Prelude. The Prelude is typically something in those days that would open a suite of stylized dances of the time. And the Prelude was really the opportunity for the composer to kind of strut their stuff a little bit as a writer. It was more free form. It did not have to follow a particular dance form the way an allemande or a courante or a sarabande would. Next, we're going to move into the classical era. And again, this is where the guitar begins to emerge in the early 19th century with really important figures like the Spaniard, once again from Spain, Fernando, but also the Italian Mauro Giuliani, who was based in Vienna, which at this time really became kind of the center of Western classical music development. Vienna was really kind of the place to be, not unlike, say, Seattle for rock and roll in the 90s, or let's say New York in hip hop in the 70s and 80s. So Vienna really became this kind of center for really the most of the most important composers of the day. Not all of them, but really Vienna was where you went if you wanted to really show, if you got that far and there was enough of a reputation. Someone like Mauro Giuliani, for example, knew Beethoven, was friends with Beethoven, Hummel, a lot of the famous composers of the day. And he was a guitarist, and he played his own music on stage. And so to the guitar, he was to the guitar kind of what Paganini would have been to the violin, a total virtuoso, kind of like a human jukebox that could kind of basically make arrangements of the most famous opera tunes of the day by Rossini or Bellini or whomever at the time. Fernando was a little bit more of a stricter classicist, more in the mold of Beethoven or a late Mozart type of fella. And he was, the bulk of his most important work was really from I would say, probably around 1820 to till his death in 1839. And he was based in Paris, which was another important center of music. So I'd like to play, again, probably one of his most beloved compositions, and this is a piece that a lot of amateur guitarists can play without too much practice. This is his famous Etude in B minor. That was the Etude in B minor by Fernando, Spanish composer. So even though Fernando was Spanish, you can hear the music. It sounds a little bit like Beethoven, doesn't it? And it so that is because he really, he moved from Spain to Paris and really wanted to be part of what we think of as a kind of a continental European scene in music composition, and was a very serious and a very, very fine composer. He also wrote a lot of great and very difficult virtuosic pieces, variations pieces. Probably his most famous piece is Variations on a Theme of Mozart, Opus 9, which is a set of wonderful variations on Mozart's, on an aria from the Magic Flute opera by Mozart. Now, as we move into what we now think of as the Romantic era, which is some historians will place this around, I guess, the early 1800s. I think of it more as 1820, 1830 until about 1900. The guitar began to move into a bit of a fallow period here because, mainly because of the modernization of the piano. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Amadeus, which is kind of a cartoonish portrayal of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Maybe it was, I don't know. It seems a very entertaining portrait anyway of Mozart. That movie is, as you see, if you've seen that movie and you see what the keyboards that they're playing on, at that point they're still playing on harpsichords, which are a kind of a thing the metal strings are plucked with a plectrum as you press down the key. The modern piano was a different type of mechanism in which when you press down the key, a hammer was sent and it would strike the string. So the piano being a percussion instrument, and the guitar really falls into that family as well as a percussion instrument. Even though the piano and the guitar have strings, we call them percussion instruments. They belong to the percussion family because they are struck. Now, this modern piano really took off. It was an entirely new innovation and really took the piano into another realm, and then all the great composers of the Romantic era and late classical era, such as Beethoven, and then on if we go into, say, Mendelssohn and Chopin, and then on through from there we go into Franz Liszt and Brahms and onward through that era. All of those composers were using this incredible sort of almost symphonic instrument with all the 88 pitches to be able to create these incredible masterworks, some of the greatest things ever written in the history of music. So the guitar kind of fell a bit out of favor here because it couldn't really compete with that, first of all, the volume, but also the range of it. And then again, the best composers would, if you were a great composer like, say, Chopin, or even earlier than that, Beethoven, you wouldn't really choose to write for the guitar if you had the choice of the piano. But this is where Spain starts to come in, because Julian Arcas from Spain in the middle 1900s began to write music, not only European continental music in the style of other European composers of the time, but also some what we think of now as nationalist Spanish pieces, where he would use the folk elements of Spain to write pieces. And then his student was probably one of the most important guitarists in history, Francisco Tarrega. And I'd like to play his piece called Lagrima for you now. It's just a very short piece. Lagrima means tears. And this is really another piece that really many guitarists pick up to play even just after a couple of years of studying the classical guitar. So this is Lagrima by Francisco Tarrega. That was Lagrima by Francisco Tarrega. Now, Francisco Tarrega didn't perform all that much. He mainly did performances, say, in his parlor. But a lot of the most important Spanish guitarists of the 20th century were there to hear him and listen to him, including Miguel Llobet and a certain gentleman named Andres Segovia, who would go on to become the most famous performer figure in the history of classical guitar. Now, Segovia became very important because he commissioned a lot of pieces from composers, and he took the guitar into the modern era. The guitar, as I had mentioned before, in the Romantic era of music had kind of fallen into a bit of a fallow period. The 20th century, Segovia did a huge amount of work, and in terms of not just commissioning, but getting guitar into music conservatories around the world. And now really guitar is a staple of every major music conservatory around the world due to his efforts. But also having the guitar have concertos written for the guitar so that the guitar would be playing on major symphony orchestra programs and more people would see the guitar. And then also he played probably thousands of solo recitals throughout his life. He lived to be 94 years old. He died in 1986 or 87, around that time. So incredibly important and influential figure as a performer. So obviously now we've moved into what we think of as the modern era or 20th century era of classical music. And this is where a lot of dissonance, musical dissonance comes in. And when we think of dissonance, we think of something like this. So when you listen to, say, Lagrima, we hear, these very pleasing kind of melody with a harmony underneath that creates, if we take this lower note, raise it up an octave, we hear thirds and major and minor thirds and fifths, right? Are kind of the staples of tonality in a way, musical tonality. What a lot of the modern composers wanted to explore, really starting with Arnold Schoenberg, was to explore things like intervals in music, like, right, or this is called a minor second. These two notes can't really get any closer to each other, right? They're right next to each other. This is a D, and then its next note after is an E flat, right? So that's an example of a very dissonant sounding interval. Another one would be what we call a tritone, which is basically an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, these kind of things here. And so composers began to kind of traffic in more of these intervals as their language. Segovia only had a certain amount of tolerance for this kind of thing. He was kind of a romantic spirit, and so the composers he tended to commission for pieces tended to be a bit more on the conservative side of things. But I'd like to play a piece for you by a true modernist, the Cuban guitarist, composer, and orchestra director of the National Symphony in Havana, Cuba for 40-something years. Leo Brouwer is still alive today. He was born in 1931, so that would make him now 91 years old. This is a wonderful piece by him called Danza Caracteristica, and this is, I played this piece on my Grammy-winning album called Play, which came out about 6 or 7 years ago. And this is a piece I learned as a little kid. And I remember when I heard it, I was 10 years old and I heard the great Australian guitarist John Williams play it on a record, and I was like, wow, that's some pretty wild stuff for my ears at the time. But then, of course, eventually, before I graduated high school, I learned that piece and then put it on that record that I made called Play, which is basically a record of just short, fun pieces to play, and this piece is very fun to play. So I'd like to play for you Danza Caracteristica by the Cuban Leo Brouwer. That was Danza Caracteristica by Leo Brouwer. And this really concludes the class that I wanted to kind of show you here with guitar and its place in classical music history and how the classical guitar is different from other kinds of guitars. So just to sort of cover, we covered the Renaissance era, around 1400 to 1600, the Baroque era, 1600 to 1750, the Classical era, 1750 to around, well, in my view anyway, 1820, the Romantic era, 1820 to 1900, and the 20th century, or modernism, which would really starts with Arnold Schoenberg around 1900 and continued into the turn of this last century. Modernism is still alive and well. In this century, a lot of composers began to return to more traditional means and also start to pull things from other world cultures. Of course, as our world, as we've become more global and the world has gotten a little bit sort of smaller in that sense, classical composers are really looking to a lot of cultures from all over the world and infuse those styles into their own music. And composers from other cultures are taking a lot of things from America too, including one of America's greatest cultural exports, jazz. Jazz really we think of as beginning in the earlier part of the 20th century with Louis Armstrong, the great trumpeter, one of the most important musicians in American history. And then the development of jazz, I'm just going to go through that very quickly. Its biggest figures after Louis Armstrong would have been, say, Duke Ellington and Miles Davis. And Duke Ellington was happening around the 30s and 40s, Miles Davis from the 1950s all the way through the 1980s. And these three musicians in particular, there were many, many other incredible musicians. I'm a huge jazz fanatic. But those three really in particular are the most important. One of the more important jazz musicians and composers of the last 40 years is the American Pat Metheny, and he's a guitarist. And I've been a huge Pat Metheny fan for a long time, so when we became friends, mutual admirers and friends around 15 years ago, he had told me some time ago, I'd like to write a piece for you, maybe just something like a 5-minute thing. He said, but I don't know if I'll ever get the time to write it. He said it might just show up in the mail. Well, I guess one day it did, but it wasn't 5 minutes, it was almost 20 minutes, and he calls it 4 Paths of Light. And it has 4 movements, and I'm going to leave you today by directing you to the, we're going to watch the video, just the audio of with the album cover on it. The album was called Road to Sun. It came out a couple years ago by Pat Metheny. And it starts with the first movement of 4 Paths of Light, performed by yours truly and produced by Pat Metheny. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed this little seminar that we've had on the classical guitar. Thanks.